The courtroom was silent. No one dared to move. The judge, a woman in her late 30s with sharp but kind eyes, sat frozen in her chair. The wooden gavel, gripped tightly in her hand, did not fall. The attorneys, the stenographer, even the bailiff, everyone was in shock. The small voice had cut through the usual formality of the court like a knife. "You're my mom." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a mistake. The 8-year-old girl standing in the middle of the courtroom had said it with certainty, her blue eyes locked onto the judge's. The room was packed with people, lawyers, foster parents, caseworkers, but in that moment, they all disappeared. Only the girl and the judge seemed to exist. A gasp ran through the crowd. The judge blinked, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. The girl stepped forward, her small hands balled into fists at her sides. "You're my mom," she repeated, louder this time. "I know you are." The judge's heart pounded in her chest. This was impossible. It had to be a mistake. And yet, why did the little girl's face feel so familiar? The courtroom waited, breathless, as the judge struggled to find words. But before she could say anything, the courtroom doors suddenly burst open. A woman in a dark suit rushed inside, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Your Honor," she called out, her voice breaking. "You need to see this, right now." Everything was happening too fast. The judge turned to the woman, her mind still spinning from the child's words. But deep down, she knew, whatever was about to happen next would change everything. 8 hours earlier, the day had started like any other in Judge Elizabeth Carter's courtroom. She had presided over countless cases, some simple, some heartbreaking. As a family court judge, her job was to make decisions that could shape a child's future, and it was never easy. Today, one of the cases on her docket involved a young girl named Lily Parker. At only 8 years old, Lily had already spent more time in the foster system than most adults spent in their first job. Her case was complicated, messy, just like so many others. Elizabeth had read the case file the night before. Neglect, abandonment, no known biological relatives. Another child lost in a system that was meant to protect her, but had instead shuffled her from home to home. The current foster parents were seeking permanent adoption, but something about the file didn't sit right with Elizabeth. There were gaps, missing records. A strange feeling settled in her stomach as she reviewed the details. And then there was the girl herself. When Lily had entered the courtroom that morning, something had happened. Something Judge Carter couldn't explain. The moment their eyes met, a chill had run down her spine. The girl had stared at her, unblinking, as if she knew her. Elizabeth had brushed it off. She was imagining things. She was tired. But now, as she sat frozen in her chair, staring at the little girl who had just called her mom, Elizabeth knew she could no longer ignore that feeling. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind the woman who had rushed in, the head of Child Protective Services, Diane Miller. Diane's face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a thick, manila folder. She didn't even glance at the crowd watching from the benches. Instead, she walked straight to the judge's bench and slid the file toward her. "You need to see this," Diane whispered. Elizabeth hesitated. Her hands shook as she reached for the folder, but before she could open it, Lily's voice rang out again. "Why don't you remember me?" The question made Elizabeth's breath catch. She looked at the little girl, her heart hammering in her chest. "Lily," she said slowly, her voice steadier than she felt. "Why do you think I'm your mother?" Lily frowned, as if frustrated by the question. "Because you are," she said simply. "I remember you." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The attorneys glanced at each other, unsure of what to do. The foster parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Elizabeth's head was spinning. This wasn't possible. It didn't make sense. But deep inside, something was telling her, no, screaming at her, that this child wasn't lying. She swallowed hard and finally opened the file Diane had given her. The first page made her blood run cold. It was a birth certificate, and under mother's name was a name she never thought she'd see on a document like this. Elizabeth Carter. Her own name. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The courtroom erupted in whispers. She turned to Diane, eyes wide with disbelief. What is this?" she whispered. Diane's voice was barely audible. "You had a daughter, Judge Carter. And she's standing right in front of you. Elizabeth felt the world tilt beneath her. She gripped the desk to steady herself. No, she breathed. That's not. I would remember. I would know. But as she stared at the little girl's face, a flicker of something buried deep in the corners of her memory, began to surface. A hospital room. A baby's cry. A choice she had forced herself to forget. A choice that was coming back to haunt her. She wasn't ready to face it. Not here. Not now. But it was too late. Lily was staring at her, waiting. The entire courtroom was waiting. And Elizabeth Carter knew. Nothing would ever be the same again. 12 years earlier. The rain poured heavily outside the small hospital window. 18-year-old Elizabeth Carter sat on the edge of the hospital bed, cradling a newborn baby in her trembling arms. She was exhausted, her body weak from hours of labor, but she couldn't take her eyes off the tiny face staring up at her. She's beautiful, the nurse said softly. Elizabeth nodded, biting her lip. Beautiful didn't even begin to describe her. She was perfect, soft pink cheeks, a tiny nose, a little tuft of dark hair. Her daughter. Tears blurred Elizabeth's vision. She wanted to believe she could keep her, raise her, be the mother this baby deserved. But reality crashed down on her like a tidal wave. She was 18. She had no family, no money, no home. She had fought so hard to get into law school, to build a future, to escape the cycle of poverty and pain she had grown up in. And now she had to make an impossible choice. Her hands shook as she pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead. I love you, she whispered. I love you so much. Then she did the hardest thing she had ever done. She let go. She let the nurse take the baby from her arms. She turned her face away as the infant's cries echoed through the room. She didn't look back, and she never spoke of it again. Until now, back in the courtroom, Elizabeth couldn't breathe. The memories came flooding back all at once, crashing over her like a wave. The baby, the choice, the pain. Lily's voice broke through her thoughts. You are my mom, the little girl said again, softer this time. I know you are. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she closed the file in front of her. She looked at Diane, then at the attorneys, then at the packed courtroom. She knew everyone was waiting for her to speak, but she had no words. Because for the first time in her life, Judge Elizabeth Carter, the woman who always had the answers, was lost. Then, just as she thought things couldn't get more complicated, the courtroom doors burst open again. This time, it wasn't a social worker. It was a man who looked like he had just seen a ghost. And when he spoke, his words sent another shockwave through the room. Judge Carter, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We need to talk about our daughter. Everything shattered. The courtroom, already tense, became suffocatingly silent. The man stood in the doorway, his chest rising and falling rapidly as if he had run all the way there. His brown hair was damp from the rain outside, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His gaze never left Judge Elizabeth Carter. Elizabeth's entire body went cold. Her throat felt dry, her mind scrambling to process his words. Our daughter. This couldn't be happening. She gripped the wooden bench in front of her, trying to ground herself, but her heart pounded so hard it was all she could hear. Who was this man? And why did he claim to have a connection to Lily? Lily, on the other hand, didn't hesitate. She turned, looking up at the man with wide, hopeful eyes. Do you know my mom? She asked softly. The man's gaze finally dropped to the little girl in front of him, and something in his expression cracked. He took a slow, unsteady step forward. His voice broke. He cleared his throat. I think I do. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The attorneys began whispering frantically among themselves, and the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Elizabeth couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Her fingers dug into the bench so hard that her knuckles turned white. Diane Miller, the Child Protective Services director, was the first to recover. She stepped forward, placing herself protectively between the man and Lily. Sir, she said firmly, this is a closed hearing. You can't just... I have the right to be here, the man interrupted, his voice steady this time. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope, handing it to Diane. She took it hesitantly, flipping it open. Her eyes widened as she scanned the documents. Elizabeth forced herself to find her voice. "Who are you?" she asked, her words barely above a whisper. The man hesitated, then lifted his eyes to hers. "You already know," he said. The air left Elizabeth's lungs. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. And yet, as she looked at his face, recognition slammed into her like a freight train. The past she had buried deep, the past she had forced herself to forget, came rushing back. 12 years ago, a summer night, warm air, the sound of waves crashing against the shore, a boy with a soft smile and tired eyes. His name was Daniel Hayes. He had been her best friend, her first love, and he had been the father of the child she had given away. Elizabeth was 18 when she found out she was pregnant. She had just gotten her acceptance letter to law school, the one thing she had fought for her entire life. The future she had dreamed of was finally within reach. And then, 2 pink lines on a test. She had been terrified. Daniel had been just as young, just as scared, but he had held her and told her they would figure it out together. She had believed him, for a while. But reality was cruel. Neither of them had the money, the support, or the ability to raise a child. And Elizabeth had always been practical. She had convinced herself that letting the baby go was the only option. Daniel had fought it. He had begged her to reconsider, to at least talk about raising the baby together. But she had been firm. She had made the decision. And then, she had disappeared. She had left their small town, cut off all contact, and never looked back. Until now, Elizabeth's knees felt weak. She gripped the bench tighter, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Daniel," she whispered. The name felt foreign on her tongue, like saying it out loud would make all of this real. Daniel took another step forward, his eyes filled with something unreadable. "It's been a long time, Liz." Liz. No one called her that anymore. Elizabeth shook her head, trying to clear the fog in her mind. How did you find us?" Daniel exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "I've been looking for her for years, Elizabeth." His voice shook with emotion. "I knew we had a daughter. I knew you gave her up. But every time I tried to find out where she went, I hit a dead end." Elizabeth's stomach twisted. "I didn't." She stopped herself. What could she say? That she had buried the pain so deep she had convinced herself it wasn't real? That she had forced herself to forget? Daniel's expression hardened. "Did you even try to find her?" The question cut deeper than she expected. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The truth was no. She hadn't. She had been too much of a coward. Daniel shook his head, his voice bitter. "Of course you didn't." A small voice cut through the tension. "Do you know why I was left alone?" Both adults turned sharply to see Lily staring at them. Her blue eyes were filled with confusion, sadness, and something worse, hope. Daniel's face softened instantly. "Lily." He knelt in front of her, his voice gentle. "I didn't know. I didn't know you were out there. If I had, I would have found you sooner." Lily hesitated, then turned to Elizabeth. "What about you?" Elizabeth's breath caught. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to face the pain, the guilt, the truth. "Lily, She trailed off, feeling completely lost. Lily's eyes searched hers, and for the first time, Elizabeth saw herself in that little girl. The same stubbornness, the same deep loneliness. And in that moment, she realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a case. This wasn't just another decision she had to make as a judge. This was her daughter, and she had to decide if she was finally ready to be her mother. Before anyone could say another word, Diane cleared her throat. "We need to take this into chambers," she said firmly. "Now." Elizabeth looked at her blankly. "Judge Carter," Diane said gently, but there was an urgency in her tone. "This is a legal matter, and a very, very complicated one." Elizabeth's heart pounded. She was a judge. She had spent years making decisions for other people's children. But now, this was her child. And for the first time in her career, she didn't know what the right decision was. She looked at Daniel. She looked at Lily. Then, taking a shaky breath, she nodded. "Chambers," she said quietly. "Now." She turned and walked toward the door, but her hands were still shaking. Because deep down, she knew The past wasn't done with her yet. The door to the judge's chambers shut with a soft click, sealing them away from the buzzing courtroom outside. The air inside the small office was thick with tension. Papers were stacked neatly on Elizabeth's desk. Her diploma hung proudly on the wall, and the scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air. But none of it mattered. Elizabeth Carter stood behind her desk, gripping the edge as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. Daniel stood by the door, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, his jaw tight with emotions he hadn't yet spoken. And in the center of the room, small and quiet, but impossible to ignore, stood Lily. Her blue eyes darted between the two adults, confusion and longing etched across her tiny face. Diane Miller, the head of Child Protective Services, cleared her throat. "We need to figure out what's going on here," she said, glancing at Elizabeth. "Because right now, Judge Carter, we have a situation unlike anything I've ever seen." Elizabeth let out a slow, shaky breath. "Tell me what you know." Diane nodded, flipping open the thick manila folder she had handed over earlier. 12 years ago, a baby girl was placed in a private adoption agency. The records show that the mother voluntarily relinquished all rights. "That mother was you, Elizabeth." Elizabeth flinched but didn't deny it. Diane continued, "But something happened. The agency responsible for the adoption shut down due to corruption, and in the process, many children's records, including Lily's, were lost in the system. She was never properly placed with a permanent family." Daniel's fist clenched. "You're telling me she's been alone this whole time?" Diane hesitated. "Not exactly. Lily has been in and out of foster homes. The system failed her, plain and simple. No one connected the dots about who her birth parents were." Elizabeth's stomach twisted painfully. She had assumed, hoped, that her daughter had gone to a loving family, that she had grown up happy, safe, loved. Instead, she had been lost, alone. Elizabeth slowly sank into her chair, her hands pressing against her forehead. She exhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay composed. "I had no idea." Daniel scoffed. "No, of course you didn't. You weren't looking." His words stung, but Elizabeth didn't have the strength to argue. Diane shifted uncomfortably. "Here's where it gets complicated. Because Lily's adoption was never finalized, legally, she has no official parents." Silence. Elizabeth looked up, her blood running cold. "What are you saying?" Diane shut the folder. "I'm saying that, as of right now, she is still legally the child of her birth parents. You, Elizabeth. And you, Daniel." Elizabeth's breath hitched. Daniel's eyes widened. Lily was still theirs? A flicker of something unreadable crossed Daniel's face. "Then we should take her home." Elizabeth's heart stopped. "What?" Daniel's voice was steady, his gaze locked onto Lily. "She's our daughter. We failed her once. We don't get to fail her again." Elizabeth's pulse pounded. "Daniel, it's not that simple. We can't just—" "Why not?" His voice rose, anger simmering beneath the surface. "You gave her up because you thought you had no choice. I didn't get a say in that decision. But now? Now we do. She's right here." Elizabeth's head spun. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She had spent years making choices for other families. She had sat in this very chair and ruled on what was best for children, for parents. And now? Now she was the one facing an impossible decision. "I don't." She swallowed hard. "I don't even know how to be a mother." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Neither do I." Then, softer, he added, "But we can learn." A small voice broke through the storm of emotions. "Do I get a choice?" Both adults turned sharply to look at Lily. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her face unreadable. But her eyes held the weight of someone who had been let down too many times. Daniel hesitated. "Lily, of course you do." She frowned. "Then why are you deciding everything without asking me?" Silence. Elizabeth's stomach twisted with guilt. She had spent her entire life making choices for people, but not with them. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. "You're right, Lily. This is your life. You deserve a say." Lily hesitated, her fingers tightening around the hem of her dress. I want to be wanted," she whispered. The word shattered something inside Elizabeth. For the first time, she truly saw Lily, not just as a case, not just as a responsibility, but as a child who had been searching for love her entire life. Her child. Elizabeth swallowed hard. You are wanted. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You have always been wanted. Lily's eyes glistened. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, finally, Diane broke the silence. Here's the situation. Legally, Lily is still in state custody. But given these circumstances, the court needs to decide what's best for her. Elizabeth nodded slowly, her mind racing. What are our options? Diane sighed. The simplest option would be for one, or both of you to petition for custody. That would require a hearing, background checks, and an evaluation of whether you're fit to be her guardians. Daniel crossed his arms. And how long does that take? A few months, maybe more, Diane admitted. Daniel's jaw clenched. That's too long. Diane hesitated. There's another option. Elizabeth looked at her warily. Which is? Diane glanced at both of them. If both of you agree, you could petition for immediate emergency guardianship while the legal process is finalized. That means Lily would go home tonight. Elizabeth's breath caught. Tonight? She looked at Lily, who was watching her with cautious hope. She looked at Daniel, whose entire posture screamed that he was ready to fight for this. And then she looked at herself, at the woman who had spent her whole life running from this moment. She wasn't ready. She was terrified. But as she looked into Lily's eyes, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She couldn't run anymore. Elizabeth took a deep, shaky breath. I want to do it, she said softly. Daniel turned to her, surprised. You do? She nodded, even though fear still clung to her bones. Yes, I do. Lily's face lit up, and for the first time, Elizabeth saw something in her that she hadn't seen before. Hope. Diane smiled, closing the file in front of her. Then let's get started. And just like that, everything changed. The weight of the decision pressed against Elizabeth Carter's chest as she walked out of her chambers. The courtroom had mostly emptied, but a few reporters loitered near the door, sensing something unusual had taken place behind closed doors. Diane Miller led them through a private exit, keeping Lily between her and Daniel as they stepped into the hallway. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the empty corridor, heavy with the reality of what they had just agreed to. Elizabeth barely felt her legs moving. This was real. She had just agreed to take Lily home. Tonight. She stole a glance at Daniel, who looked tense but determined. His protective stance around Lily hadn't changed since they left the chambers. He had always been like that, loyal, stubborn, unwilling to back down when it mattered. She had been the one to leave. She had been the one to make the choice that changed everything. And now, 12 years later, she was standing next to the very person she had once walked away from, facing the consequences of the past. Lily held the stuffed rabbit she had brought to court that morning, her small fingers clutching it tightly. She was quiet, but her eyes darted between them, as if she wasn't sure whether to believe this was really happening. Elizabeth finally found her voice. Lily, I know this is a lot to take in. You don't have to decide anything right now. We just want to make sure you're safe and happy. Lily tilted her head. Are you happy? Elizabeth blinked, startled by the question. What? You don't look happy, Lily said simply. Elizabeth hesitated, forcing a small smile. I guess I'm just nervous. Lily nodded as if she understood. Me too. They reached the exit doors, where Diane stopped and turned to face them. I've arranged for a caseworker to visit your homes within the next 48 hours, she told Elizabeth and Daniel. Standard procedure. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. So what happens now? Diane exhaled. Now, we file the emergency guardianship petition and get the paperwork in order. In the meantime, both of you are responsible for Lily's care. Elizabeth felt like she had been thrown into deep water. And where is she supposed to go? Diane gave her a knowing look. That depends. Where do you want her to go? Elizabeth swallowed. She knew what Diane was really asking. Would Lily be staying with her? Or with Daniel? She hadn't thought that far ahead. She turned to Daniel, whose expression was unreadable. I have an extra room at my place, he said carefully. But if you want her to stay with you. Elizabeth hesitated. Did she? She had lived alone for years. She had built a quiet, structured life, free of distractions, free of complications. Bringing a child into that life, even her own child, would change everything. And yet, she looked down at Lily, who stared up at her with cautious hope. The choice wasn't about her anymore. It was about Lily. Taking a deep breath, she made her decision. "You should stay with me," she told Lily softly. Lily blinked. "Really?" Elizabeth's heart clenched. "She thinks I'll change my mind." She forced herself to kneel in front of the little girl, looking her in the eyes. "Yes," she said firmly. "If that's okay with you." Lily's lips parted in surprise. Then, slowly, she nodded. Elizabeth stood and turned to Daniel. "You can come too," she added. "At least for tonight. We'll figure this out together." Daniel exhaled and nodded. "Yeah, okay." Diane smiled approvingly. Then it settled. And just like that, Elizabeth Carter, a woman who had spent her entire career deciding the fates of other families, had just formed one of her own. The ride home. Elizabeth's house was quiet, too quiet, as she unlocked the door and led Lily and Daniel inside. Lily stepped in cautiously, her small sneakers barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. Her eyes flickered around the space. Tidy bookshelves, a gray couch, a kitchen that looked barely used. It didn't look like a place for a kid. It looked like a place for a woman who lived alone. Elizabeth suddenly felt self-conscious. She had never needed her house to feel warm before. But now, standing here with a child in tow, she realized how cold it might seem. She cleared her throat. "I don't have a kid's room, but I can set up something nice for you." Lily shrugged. "I can sleep on the couch." The casual way she said it made something twist in Elizabeth's chest. "No," she said quickly. "You deserve a real bed. Give me a few minutes, okay?" Lily nodded and wandered toward the couch. Daniel leaned against the counter, watching Elizabeth closely. "Are you okay?" Elizabeth let out a humorless laugh. "I just brought home a child I gave up 12 years ago. So no, Daniel, I don't think I'm okay." He crossed his arms. "You didn't have to do this." She stiffened. "And what would you have done if I didn't?" His jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. Because they both knew the truth. He would have taken Lily himself. And Elizabeth wasn't sure she could live with that. Not now. Not after everything. She turned away, walking toward the spare room that had been nothing but a storage space for years. If Lily was going to stay, she needed a proper place to sleep. She pushed the door open, revealing an empty room with only a desk and some boxes. Not exactly welcoming. Elizabeth sighed and glanced back at the living room, where Lily sat quietly on the couch, hugging her stuffed rabbit. This wasn't just her house anymore. For the first time, it had to be a home, and she had no idea where to start. Later that night, Elizabeth lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Lily was asleep in the spare room, wrapped in extra blankets, her stuffed rabbit still clutched in her arms. Daniel had stayed late, making sure Lily felt comfortable before finally heading to a nearby hotel. Now, alone in the quiet of the night, Elizabeth felt the weight of everything sink in. She was responsible for a child who had been searching for her, a child she had left behind. And no matter how much she wanted to, she couldn't take back the past. But maybe she could do better now. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. But just as she drifted off, a small voice came from the doorway. "Judge Carter." Elizabeth's eyes snapped open. Lily stood there, barefoot, clutching her rabbit. Elizabeth sat up. "What's wrong?" Lily hesitated. Can I sleep here? Just for tonight?" Elizabeth's throat tightened. She didn't hesitate this time. "Of course." Lily climbed onto the bed, curling up beside her. Elizabeth stayed still for a moment, then, hesitantly, she placed a hand on Lily's back. The little girl sighed, relaxing, and for the first time in years, Elizabeth Carter felt something deep inside her begin to thaw. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She was a mother. And no matter how scared she wasn't going to run this time. Not ever again. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, casting golden streaks across the sheets. Elizabeth woke to the soft, rhythmic breathing of the little girl curled up beside her. For a few moments, she lay still, watching Lily sleep. It was surreal. Yesterday, she had been a judge, a woman with a structured life, a clear purpose. Today, she was waking up as a mother to a child who had spent most of her life without one. A soft sigh escaped Lily's lips as she stirred, her small body shifting beneath the covers. Her fingers tightened around her stuffed rabbit before her eyes fluttered open. For a brief second, confusion crossed her face. Then she looked up and met Elizabeth's gaze. "You're still here," Lily murmured, her voice groggy with sleep. Elizabeth's chest tightened. "Of course, I'm still here." Lily blinked up at her, as if testing to see if she was telling the truth. Then, slowly, she nodded and sat up, rubbing her eyes. A knock on the front door broke the quiet moment. Elizabeth's heart jumped. Daniel. She glanced at the clock, 7:45 a.m. He was early. Lily climbed off the bed and followed her as she made her way to the front door. When Elizabeth opened it, she found Daniel standing there, 2 coffees in hand, dark circles under his eyes. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said, stepping inside. Elizabeth sighed. "I could say the same about you." Daniel handed her one of the coffees and glanced down at Lily. "Morning, kid." Lily offered a small smile. "Morning." He ruffled her hair before looking back at Elizabeth. "You ready for this?" "For what?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "The caseworker's visit. They said within 48 hours. That means today or tomorrow." Elizabeth groaned, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Right. That." Diane had warned them last night that the caseworker would come by for a home assessment. That was bad. Not because Elizabeth had anything to hide, but because her house was the furthest thing from a child-friendly environment. Lily didn't even have a proper room yet. Daniel seemed to read her mind. "I brought some stuff," he said, gesturing toward his car. "Toys. A few clothes. Stuff I picked up this morning." Elizabeth stared at him. "You went shopping?" Daniel shrugged. "She's our kid. I figured she should have more than one outfit." Lily blinked up at him. "You got stuff for me?" Daniel knelt down, leveling his gaze with hers. "Yeah, kid. You don't have to carry everything by yourself anymore." Lily's face softened, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she bit her lip and nodded. Elizabeth exhaled slowly. They could do this, or at least they could try. It was worse than Elizabeth had expected. The caseworker, a woman named Margaret Hughes, arrived by noon. She was in her mid-40s, with a clipboard in one hand and a calculating gaze that made Elizabeth feel like she was already failing. Daniel was there too, sitting beside Lily on the couch, his hand resting on his knee like he was bracing for impact. Margaret flipped through her notes. "Judge Carter, Mr. Hayes, thank you for allowing this visit on such short notice. I have a few questions before we do a walkthrough of the home." Elizabeth folded her hands in her lap. "Of course." Margaret's gaze shifted to Lily. "Sweetheart, can I ask you a few things first?" Lily hesitated, then nodded. Margaret smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "How are you feeling about all of this?" Lily's small fingers tightened around her stuffed rabbit. "I don't know." Margaret jotted something down. "Do you feel safe here?" Lily glanced at Elizabeth, then at Daniel. After a pause, she gave a small nod. "Yeah. Would you say they take good care of you?" Another pause. Lily hesitated before answering. "They're trying." Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. Margaret hummed, writing something else down before turning her attention back to the adults. "Lily's been through a lot of instability," she said. "We need to make sure this placement is what's best for her." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "What exactly are you looking for?" Margaret regarded him carefully. "Routine, stability, a safe, structured environment." She turned to Elizabeth. "Judge Carter, I assume you have experience with children through your work, but have you ever been a guardian before?" Elizabeth hesitated. "No." Margaret made a note. "And Mr. Hayes?" Daniel shook his head. "No, but I've been looking for her for years. I'm not just some stranger." Margaret nodded. "That's good to hear. But emotional connection isn't the only factor here. Parenting requires structure." Elizabeth's stomach twisted. Margaret set down her clipboard. "I'd like to see the space where Lily will be staying." Elizabeth swallowed hard. "Right. This way." She led them to the spare room. It was barely a room. The night before, Elizabeth had done everything she could to make it feel like a child's space. She had moved out the storage boxes, borrowed some bedding, and even placed a small nightlight on the table. But it wasn't much. Margaret surveyed the room carefully, taking her time before turning back to them. It's a good start, but it's clear this house wasn't originally set up for a child. Elizabeth nodded stiffly. I know. I'm working on it. Margaret pursed her lips. And what about school? Has she been enrolled anywhere? Elizabeth hesitated. School. She hadn't even thought about that yet. Daniel cleared his throat. We're looking into it. We just got her, so it's a process. Margaret wrote something else down. I understand. But for Lily's sake, I'd recommend making those arrangements quickly. She closed her notebook. I'll file my initial report tonight. You'll hear from me in a few days with next steps. Elizabeth's palms were damp as she led Margaret to the door. As the caseworker stepped outside, she turned back with a final glance at Lily. You're a brave little girl, she said kindly. If you ever need anything, you let us know. Okay? Lily nodded but didn't say anything. Then Margaret was gone. The second the door shut, Elizabeth let out a long, exhausted breath. Well, Daniel muttered, that was fun. Elizabeth shot him a look. She's deciding if we get to keep her. Daniel shrugged. Then we do whatever it takes. Elizabeth turned to Lily, who stood in the middle of the room, looking small and unsure. Something inside her softened. She walked over, kneeling so they were eye level. Hey, you did great. Lily hesitated. Am I staying? Elizabeth's chest ached. Yes, she whispered. You're staying. For the first time, Lily's lips curled into a tiny smile. And in that moment, Elizabeth knew. She would never let her go again. The caseworker's visit had left a lingering tension in the air. Even after Margaret had gone, the weight of her judgment still hung over the house like a storm cloud. Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. Across from her, Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching her carefully. Lily sat between them, quietly eating a bowl of cereal, her small spoon clinking against the ceramic. So, Daniel said, breaking the silence, we need to figure out a school. Elizabeth sighed, rubbing her temples. I know. She's 8, right? Daniel continued. That means 2nd or 3rd grade. We should find something stable for her. Somewhere she can stay long-term. Lily suddenly tensed, her spoon stopping mid-air. Elizabeth noticed immediately. Lily? The little girl hesitated. Do I have to go to school? Elizabeth frowned. Well, yes. School is important. Lily lowered her gaze. I don't like school. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Why not? She shrugged. I never stay long enough to make friends. Every time I start somewhere, I have to leave again. A painful silence filled the kitchen. Elizabeth's stomach twisted. Of course. She had been moved from home to home, never staying in one place long enough to feel like she belonged. This was just another reminder that Lily wasn't used to stability. Elizabeth softened her tone. Lily, I promise you won't have to leave this time. Lily looked up, her expression hesitant. You don't know that. Elizabeth exhaled, her heart aching at how matter-of-fact Lily sounded about her own uncertainty. We're going to do everything we can to make sure you stay, Elizabeth said firmly. And school is part of that. Lily didn't answer. Daniel leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. What if we let her pick? Elizabeth glanced at him. Pick? Yeah, he said. We tour a few schools. Let her see what feels right. He turned to Lily. What do you think? Would that help? Lily blinked. You'd let me choose? Daniel shrugged. Why not? It's your school. Shouldn't you have a say? Lily hesitated, then gave a small nod. Elizabeth felt a twinge of surprise. She had spent so much time making decisions for people that she had never thought about letting Lily have control over something as small as this. Maybe Daniel was onto something. Okay, Elizabeth agreed. We'll take a look at some schools tomorrow. Lily gave a hesitant smile, and for the first time since the caseworker's visit, the tension in the room eased. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth was sorting through paperwork in her office when the doorbell rang. She frowned. They weren't expecting anyone. Daniel, who had been helping Lily set up her new room, poked his head out from the hallway. You expecting company? No, Elizabeth muttered, pushing herself up from her chair. She walked to the door and opened it, only to freeze. Standing on her doorstep was Margaret Hughes, the caseworker from earlier. Elizabeth's pulse spiked. Margaret? Margaret gave a tight smile, but there was something different about her now. Less formal. More hesitant. May I come in? She asked. Elizabeth stepped aside, her heart racing. Margaret walked in, glancing around before turning to Elizabeth. I know I already conducted the home visit, Margaret started, but something came up. Elizabeth folded her arms. What is it? Margaret exhaled, lowering her voice. Lily's birth records aren't the only thing that got lost in the system, she said. Elizabeth's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Margaret hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. Elizabeth's breath caught. What's in there? Margaret's voice was quiet. It's information about Lily's mother. Elizabeth felt the room tilt slightly. What? Margaret licked her lips. You know how I said that some of the records from Lily's adoption were misplaced? Elizabeth nodded slowly. Margaret handed her the envelope. Someone, she said carefully, requested those records years ago. Elizabeth's fingers trembled as she took the envelope. Her entire world was tilting on its axis. She had assumed Lily had been lost in the system, that no one had known where she was, but someone had been looking for her. Elizabeth's breath hitched. Who? Margaret's expression turned unreadable. That's what I need to talk to you about, she said. Then, softly, it wasn't Daniel. Elizabeth's heart stopped. Her fingers tightened around the envelope. A chill ran down her spine. If it wasn't Daniel, then who? The answer lay inside that envelope, and Elizabeth wasn't sure she was ready to open it. The past comes knocking. Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table, the envelope in front of her, unopened. Daniel sat across from her, watching her carefully. Lily was in the other room, setting up her books, completely unaware of what was happening. Daniel's eyes flickered to the envelope. You gonna open it? Elizabeth hesitated. She had spent years not looking back. Now, the past was knocking on her door, demanding answers. Finally, she took a deep breath and tore the envelope open. Her eyes scanned the contents, old documents, notes, an official request form, and then her heart stopped. At the bottom of one of the pages was a name she never expected to see again, a name that sent a shockwave through her entire body. Rebecca Sinclair. Elizabeth's hands shook. Daniel frowned. Who's Rebecca Sinclair? Elizabeth's voice came out barely above a whisper. She's my mother. Daniel stiffened. Your mother? Elizabeth felt sick. Her mother had been searching for Lily? But why? She hadn't seen Rebecca Sinclair in 20 years. And now, somehow, she was tangled in this? Daniel leaned forward. Elizabeth, he said slowly, if your mother's been looking for Lily, we need to find out why. Elizabeth swallowed hard. Because deep down, she knew one thing for certain. If Rebecca Sinclair was involved, it wasn't good. Elizabeth's fingers trembled as she clutched the papers. Her mother's name, Rebecca Sinclair, stared back at her in bold, black ink. Daniel's voice was steady, but she could hear the tension beneath it. Elizabeth, what is this? She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. I haven't spoken to my mother in over 20 years. Daniel's brow furrowed. And now, suddenly, she's connected to our daughter? Elizabeth's throat tightened. She forced herself to look at the document again, scanning the details. The request was dated 5 years ago. Rebecca Sinclair had submitted a formal inquiry to the adoption agency, asking for information about a child born to Elizabeth Carter. Her hands clenched into fists. She hadn't just been looking for any child. She had been looking for Lily. Elizabeth shook her head, while rising in her throat. No, this doesn't make sense. Daniel leaned forward. What doesn't? She never cared about me, Elizabeth whispered. Why would she care about Lily? Daniel's jaw tightened. You're saying she wasn't a good mother? Elizabeth let out a bitter laugh. Good? Daniel, my mother. She stopped herself, exhaling shakily. She was cruel, controlling. I spent my whole life trying to get away from her. Daniel was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. And now she's looking for Lily. Elizabeth's stomach twisted. I don't understand why. Daniel took the papers from her, scanning the details. It says she requested the records, but there's no note saying whether or not she ever found her. Elizabeth's breath hitched. What if she did? A horrifying thought slammed into her. What if Rebecca Sinclair had known where Lily was this whole time? What if she had been watching, waiting? And why had she never stepped forward? Daniel's expression darkened. We need to find her. Elizabeth's pulse pounded. I don't know if I can. You don't have a choice, Daniel said, his voice firm but not unkind. She's connected to Lily now, whether we like it or not. We need answers. Elizabeth closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. Daniel was right. She didn't have a choice. After putting Lily to bed that night, Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table, her phone resting in front of her like a ticking bomb. Daniel sat across from her, watching in silence. She hadn't dialed her mother's number in 20 years. And yet, here she was, about to do the one thing she had sworn she would never do. With a deep breath, she picked up the phone and dialed. It rang. Once. Twice. Then, a voice. Rebecca Sinclair. Elizabeth froze. The sound of her mother's voice sent an old, familiar chill down her spine. She swallowed hard. Mom, it's me. Silence. Then, a quiet chuckle. Well, Rebecca murmured. I was wondering when you'd call. Elizabeth gripped the phone tighter. You knew. A pause. Then, coolly. Of course I knew. The room spun. Daniel sat up straighter, eyes locked on her. Elizabeth's pulse pounded in her ears. You've known where Lily was this whole time? Another pause. Then, not at first, Rebecca admitted. But I found out. And I waited. Elizabeth's stomach churned. For what? A slow exhale. For you to figure it out. Elizabeth's breath hitched. You knew she was in the foster system, that she was alone. And you did nothing? Rebecca's voice remained cold. I wasn't the one who gave her up, Elizabeth. A sharp pain stabbed through Elizabeth's chest. You don't get to judge me, she snapped. Oh, sweetheart, Rebecca said, voice laced with amusement. I don't need to. You're already judging yourself. Elizabeth clenched her jaw. Why did you look for her? Silence. Then, because she's mine too. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. What did you just say? She whispered. Rebecca's voice was eerily calm. I want to see my granddaughter. Elizabeth hung up the phone, her hands shaking. Daniel's eyes were sharp with concern. What did she say? Elizabeth opened her mouth, but no words came out. Daniel stood, stepping closer. Elizabeth. She forced herself to speak. She wants to see Lily. Daniel's face darkened. Absolutely not. Elizabeth's mind was spinning. She said Lily is hers too. Daniel stiffened. What does that mean? I don't know, Elizabeth whispered. But I don't trust her. Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. We need to be careful. Elizabeth nodded, swallowing back the fear rising in her throat, because she knew one thing for certain. Rebecca Sinclair was dangerous, and she wasn't going to walk away without a fight. Elizabeth barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, her mother's voice echoed in her head. Because she's mine too. What did Rebecca mean by that? Was it just manipulation? A way to get inside Elizabeth's head like she always had? Or was there something deeper, something worse lurking beneath the surface? By the time the first rays of morning light crept through the window, Elizabeth knew one thing. She couldn't ignore this. Rebecca Sinclair wasn't a woman who made empty threats. And if she was trying to claim any kind of right over Lily, then something was very, very wrong. Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched cup of coffee. Daniel was pacing the room, frustration rolling off him in waves. So, what's the plan? He asked. Elizabeth sighed. We find out exactly what my mother wants. And we make sure she never gets anywhere near Lily. Daniel frowned. She sounded serious, didn't she? Elizabeth nodded, gripping the edge of the table. Dead serious. Daniel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. We need to know what she's up to. Elizabeth glanced toward the hallway, where Lily was still asleep. She didn't want her to hear any of this. Daniel must have noticed her hesitation because he dropped his voice. Elizabeth, We have to consider the possibility that she's doing something legal. If she's filed for custody or... Elizabeth's stomach twisted. She wouldn't. But as soon as she said it, she realized she didn't know that. Rebecca Sinclair was capable of anything. Elizabeth pushed back from the table and grabbed her phone. I'm calling Diane, she said. If there's something in the system, she'll find it. An hour later, Elizabeth sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel as she listened to Diane's voice on the other end of the phone. I checked everything, Diane said, her tone sharp. And you were right to be worried. Elizabeth's pulse spiked. What do you mean? Diane sighed. Rebecca Sinclair filed a petition for guardianship over Lily 6 months ago. Elizabeth's breath left her body. What? It was denied, Diane quickly added. Since she had no direct legal ties to Lily, the court didn't approve it. Elizabeth tried to process what she was hearing. But why? Why would she even try? Diane hesitated. I don't know. But I do know this. Rebecca Sinclair doesn't give up easily. If she wants something, she finds a way to get it. Elizabeth gritted her teeth. I know. There was a pause. Elizabeth, Diane said carefully, you need to be prepared. If she's been fighting for custody in the past, she might try again. Elizabeth's stomach churned. She can't. Legally, she has no right. But that doesn't mean she won't find a loophole, Diane warned. You know how people like her operate. Elizabeth closed her eyes. She did know. Rebecca Sinclair didn't play by the rules. She played by her own rules. And if she had already tried to claim Lily once, she would try again. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth was in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. Her heart immediately shot into her throat. Daniel, who had been on the couch flipping through a legal book, looked up. Who is that? He asked, standing. Elizabeth's hands were shaking as she walked to the door. Something felt wrong. When she pulled it open, her entire body locked in place. Because standing on her doorstep, dressed in an elegant dark coat, a knowing smile on her lips, was Rebecca Sinclair. Hello, sweetheart, Rebecca said smoothly. Aren't you going to invite your mother in? Elizabeth couldn't move. For a moment, she was 16 again, standing in the cold, hearing her mother's cruel words after failing to meet her impossible expectations. You will never be enough, Elizabeth. The old wounds cracked open like they had never healed. Daniel appeared behind her, his presence grounding her, his body immediately shifting to protective mode. Rebecca's sharp blue eyes flickered to him. Daniel Hayes, she mused. Still following my daughter around after all these years? Daniel's entire body tensed. What are you doing here? Rebecca let out a soft chuckle. I came to see my granddaughter. Elizabeth's hands curled into fists. You don't have a granddaughter. Rebecca's smile didn't waver. That's not what the law says. Elizabeth's stomach turned ice cold. What does that mean? Rebecca exhaled, tilting her head. It means, dear, that I've been very patient. I gave you years to figure this out on your own. But now that you have... Her gaze darkened. It's time for me to step in. Elizabeth's breath caught. Daniel took a step forward, his voice firm. You're not going anywhere near Lily. Rebecca didn't even flinch. I have rights, Daniel. More than you think. Elizabeth finally found her voice. You filed for custody, and you were denied. Rebecca shrugged. For now. Elizabeth's blood turned to fire. Stay away from her. Rebecca's smile disappeared. Or what? She asked, her voice suddenly cold. Elizabeth's jaw clenched. Or I will make sure you never see her again. A tense silence thickened the air. Then, Rebecca's lips curled into a smirk. Oh, sweetheart, she murmured. We both know it's not that simple. Then, softly, see you in court. And with that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement. Elizabeth couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because she knew this wasn't over. Rebecca wasn't just here to cause trouble. She was here to take Lily. And if Elizabeth wasn't careful, she just might win. Elizabeth barely heard the door click shut. Her mind was spinning, her breath shallow. See you in court. Rebecca's words rattled in her skull like a warning bell. Daniel stood beside her, his jaw clenched so tightly she thought it might crack. She's bluffing, he muttered, though his tone was anything but certain. Elizabeth swallowed hard. No, she whispered. She's not. Daniel exhaled sharply. You really think she'd try to take Lily? Elizabeth turned to face him, her hands shaking. Daniel, my mother doesn't try to do anything. She takes. And she wins. Daniel's gaze darkened. Not this time. Elizabeth wanted to believe him. She really did. But Rebecca Sinclair was a force of nature. And when she wanted something, she didn't stop until she had it. Elizabeth had spent her entire life running from her mother. Now she had to turn and fight. The next morning, Elizabeth called Diane. She came to my house, Elizabeth said without preamble. Diane cursed under her breath. I was afraid of this. Elizabeth paced the living room, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles ached. She said she'd see me in court. Diane sighed. That means she's already filed something. I'll check the system. Elizabeth's stomach twisted. And if she has? Then we fight, Diane said firmly. And we win. Elizabeth wanted to believe that. But a terrible, gnawing doubt clung to her chest. Because Rebecca Sinclair always played dirty. That night, Elizabeth found Lily curled up in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her small hands clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly, and her brow was furrowed in deep thought. Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed. Can't sleep? Lily hesitated, then shook her head. Elizabeth tucked a stray strand of hair behind the little girl's ear. Do you want to talk about it? Lily bit her lip. The lady that came today. Elizabeth's heart stopped. You saw her? Lily nodded slowly. I was in my room, but I heard her voice. Elizabeth swallowed. Did you hear what she said? Lily hesitated. Then, so quietly it almost wasn't there. Is she going to take me away? A sharp pain shot through Elizabeth's chest. No, she said immediately. Lily's eyes darted to hers, searching for the truth. Elizabeth took a steadying breath. No one is taking you away, Lily. Not now. Not ever. Lily's fingers curled tighter around her stuffed rabbit. People always say that, she whispered. Elizabeth felt something in her break. How many times had this child been promised safety, only to have it ripped away? Elizabeth wasn't going to let that happen again. She leaned in closer. Lily, listen to me, she said softly but firmly. You are mine, and no one is taking you from me. Lily's lower lip trembled. Even if the court says so? Elizabeth's heart clenched. She exhaled, forcing steel into her voice. The court won't. Lily searched her face for a long moment. Then, finally, she nodded. And for the first time that night, she closed her eyes and let herself fall asleep. Elizabeth sat beside her for a long time, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. Then, softly, she reached out and took Lily's small hand in her own. And she made herself a promise. She would fight. She would win. And she would never let her daughter go again. The next morning, Elizabeth's worst fears were confirmed. Diane called with news. She filed an emergency petition for custody. Elizabeth nearly dropped the phone. On what grounds? She's claiming you're unfit, Diane said. That you abandoned Lily, that you have no experience raising a child, and that she's the only stable option. Elizabeth's hands clenched into fists. That woman emotionally abused me my entire childhood. How is she even allowed to make this claim? Diane sighed. Because she has money, influence, and she's smart. Elizabeth swallowed the lump in her throat. How do we fight this? Diane's voice turned firm. We build our case. We prove you are the best person for Lily. And we expose Rebecca Sinclair for who she really is. Elizabeth exhaled slowly. And if the court believes her? A long silence. Then Diane said something that made Elizabeth's blood run cold. If she wins, Lily will go with her. Permanently. Elizabeth's grip tightened around the phone. Over my dead body. Elizabeth and Daniel spent the next week preparing. They met with lawyers, gathered evidence, spoke to Lily's caseworkers. Every document, every witness, every detail mattered. They needed to prove that Elizabeth wasn't just a good guardian. She was the only right choice for Lily. But deep down, Elizabeth knew one thing. Rebecca Sinclair wouldn't play fair. She never did. And on the day of the hearing, Elizabeth walked into that courtroom knowing one thing. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a war. And she was going to win. because this time, she was fighting for her daughter. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, their pens poised over notepads, eager to catch every word of what was shaping up to be the most explosive custody battle in recent history. At the front of the room, Elizabeth sat at the petitioner's table, her hands clasped tightly together. Daniel sat beside her, his jaw clenched. On the other side of the courtroom, Rebecca Sinclair sat with her team of attorneys. She looked perfectly composed, dressed in an expensive navy blue suit, her hair styled in a sleek twist. She didn't look like a woman who was about to steal a child. She looked like a woman who had already won. Elizabeth gritted her teeth. Not this time. The judge, a gray-haired man with a stern expression, banged his gavel. Court is now in session. This is a guardianship hearing for the minor child, Lily Parker. We will hear arguments from both sides before reaching a decision. Elizabeth's pulse hammered. This was it. It was time to fight. Rebecca's attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Philip Reeves, was the first to speak. He stood, buttoning his jacket before addressing the judge. Your Honor, my client, Rebecca Sinclair, is here today because she is deeply concerned for the welfare of her granddaughter, Lily Parker. Elizabeth stiffened. Philip continued, his voice smooth and controlled. It is an undeniable fact that Lily has been bounced from foster home to foster home for most of her life. She has never had the stability she deserves. Now, my client wishes to provide that stability. Elizabeth's fingers dug into the table. Rebecca sat still, her hands folded in her lap, wearing the expression of a concerned grandmother who only wanted what was best. It was all an act. Philip turned slightly, his gaze landing directly on Elizabeth. Furthermore, while we acknowledge that Judge Carter is Lily's biological mother, the facts speak for themselves. She abandoned Lily as a baby, leaving her in a broken system. A woman who willingly gave up her child once should not be entrusted with her now. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Elizabeth's stomach twisted. That was exactly what Rebecca wanted, to make Elizabeth look like an unfit mother before she even had the chance to speak. Philip turned back to the judge. My client has the financial resources, experience, and ability to provide a safe, permanent home for Lily. We ask that the court grant her guardianship. He sat down. Rebecca smiled. Elizabeth's blood boiled. Daniel leaned toward her. Breathe, he murmured. Don't let them rattle you. Elizabeth inhaled sharply, forcing herself to focus. She couldn't afford to lose her temper. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. Her attorney, Rachel Lawson, stood next. Rachel was a fierce, no-nonsense woman who had spent years fighting custody battles, and she hated people like Rebecca Sinclair. She stepped forward, addressing the court with confidence. Your Honor, my client, Judge Elizabeth Carter, is here today not just as a legal petitioner, but as a mother fighting for the right to raise her own child. Elizabeth's throat tightened. Rachel continued. Yes, my client made the difficult decision to place Lily for adoption years ago. But let's be clear. She did so believing Lily would have a stable, loving home. That did not happen. The system failed her, and my client was unaware of her daughter's circumstances until recently. Rachel's voice grew stronger. Since learning the truth, my client has done everything in her power to step up, take responsibility, and provide Lily with the loving home she always deserved. She turned, leveling her gaze at Rebecca. And let's talk about Ms. Sinclair. Rebecca's smile faltered. Rachel walked slowly toward the judge. Ms. Sinclair claims to be a loving grandmother who wants to care for Lily. Yet, we must ask, why did she wait? A murmur ran through the courtroom. Rachel's voice hardened. If Ms. Sinclair truly wanted to help Lily, why did she not intervene years ago? Why did she let this child suffer, moving from home to home, while she sat comfortably with her wealth and power? Rebecca's jaw tightened. Rachel wasn't done. And more importantly, she said, her voice cold, we have documented evidence of Ms. Sinclair's abusive past. Gasps rippled through the room. Rebecca's expression darkened. Rachel turned to the judge. My client did not come from a loving home, Your Honor. She came from a home where she was emotionally manipulated and controlled by the very woman sitting across from us today. She held up a file. In this document, we have witness statements, personal accounts, and even past therapy records confirming the abuse my client endured at the hands of Ms. Sinclair. The judge took the file, flipping through it. Rachel's voice never wavered. Ms. Sinclair does not want custody of Lily because she loves her, Rachel stated. She wants custody because she sees Lily as another pawn, another child she can control, just like she tried to control my client. She turned, facing Rebecca directly. But this time, she won't win. Silence suffocated the courtroom. Rebecca's face was stone cold. Elizabeth's heart pounded, because for the first time in her life, someone was fighting for her. The judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He turned to Rebecca. Ms. Sinclair, do you have anything to say in response to these allegations? Rebecca's mask cracked. Her fingers clenched into fists. She stood slowly, her smile completely gone. Your Honor, she said, her voice eerily calm. This is a personal attack. The judge arched an eyebrow. Ms. Sinclair, the court does not take allegations of abuse lightly. Rebecca's eyes flickered toward Elizabeth, filled with rage. This girl, Rebecca spat, has always been ungrateful. I raised her. I gave her everything. And this is how she repays me? Elizabeth flinched. It was like she was 16 again, hearing those same cruel words. But this time, she didn't break. She sat up straighter, meeting her mother's glare with quiet strength. The judge sighed. That will be enough, Ms. Sinclair. Rebecca's mouth snapped shut. The judge looked between both sides before exhaling deeply. I've heard enough, he said. I will review the evidence and issue a ruling shortly. The courtroom buzzed as people whispered. But Elizabeth? She simply sat there, her heart pounding, waiting for the moment that would change everything. Would she lose Lily? Or had she finally won? The judge picked up his gavel. And then, he spoke. The court rules in favor of... Bang! The doors to the courtroom slammed open. A woman rushed inside, her face pale with urgency. Your Honor, she gasped. We have an emergency. Elizabeth's breath caught, because in her hands, the woman held a new document, one that could change everything. And suddenly, the case was far from over. The entire courtroom froze. The woman who had just burst through the doors was a young clerk from the courthouse records department. She clutched a thick envelope in her trembling hands, her face pale with urgency. The judge sighed heavily, setting his gavel down. Miss Thompson, this is highly irregular. What is the meaning of this interruption? The clerk took a deep breath. Your Honor, we just received new evidence regarding the custody of Lily Parker. This information was sealed in an older file and only just surfaced this morning. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. New evidence? Rebecca's eyes narrowed dangerously. Daniel, beside Elizabeth, whispered under his breath, What the hell is going on? The judge gestured for the clerk to approach. She hurried forward and placed the envelope on his bench. He opened it, flipping through the pages with a furrowed brow. The silence was agonizing. Then, his eyes widened. His lips pressed into a thin line. And finally, he looked up. Miss Carter, he said slowly. Mr. Hayes. His gaze flicked toward Rebecca. Ms. Sinclair. Elizabeth could barely breathe. This changes everything, the judge announced, his voice firm. The judge cleared his throat. This document contains an original adoption agreement, one that was never processed due to an administrative error. Elizabeth's pulse spiked. An adoption agreement? The judge scanned the paper, his face unreadable. Then he turned his sharp gaze toward Rebecca. It seems that 12 years ago, he said slowly, an individual applied to adopt Lily Parker as their legal guardian. Elizabeth felt sick. She had assumed, prayed, that Lily had been placed with a loving family, that someone had wanted her. But no one had ever told her the truth. Her hands clenched into fists. Who? She wanted to ask. But the judge spoke before she could. The applicant, he continued, was Rebecca Sinclair. A shockwave rippled through the room. Gasps, murmurs, whispers. Elizabeth's head snapped toward her mother, heart pounding. That's not possible, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca's face was stone cold, but Elizabeth saw something flicker in her eyes. Something dark. The judge continued. Miss Sinclair, would you care to explain why you applied for guardianship of Lily 12 years ago? Silence. The air was thick, suffocating. Then, Rebecca smirked, and everything inside Elizabeth screamed danger. Rebecca leaned forward. "Oh, sweetheart," she said smoothly. "You really don't remember, do you?" Elizabeth felt sick. "Remember what?" Rebecca's smirk deepened, and then she dropped the bombshell. "Lily was never supposed to go to the foster system," she said. "She was supposed to be mine." Elizabeth's vision blurred. She barely registered Daniel cursing under his breath. Rebecca kept talking. 12 years ago, when you gave up that baby, I was already waiting to take her in. I filed for emergency guardianship. I had the resources, the power. I had everything ready." Elizabeth shook her head, disbelief clawing at her throat. "That doesn't make sense. If you filed for guardianship, then why did she end up in foster care?" Rebecca's smirk finally faded, and for the first time, she looked angry. "Because you were always so damn selfish," she spat. "You didn't just give up that baby, Elizabeth. You cut me out completely. You made sure I couldn't find her. You filed the adoption through a private agency, not the state. You made sure I had no claim." Elizabeth's hands shook. She had done that? Her mind raced back, 12 years ago. She had been terrified. She had been desperate to make sure Lily was placed in a loving home. And she had been so afraid of her mother finding out. Had she deliberately blocked Rebecca from taking Lily? Had she made sure her mother never got near her? A wave of nausea crashed into her. She had done it to protect her daughter. But in the process, she had lost her anyway. Rebecca's voice was sharp. "The moment I found out she was gone, I searched for years. I petitioned the state for information, but her records were sealed. The system was a mess, and by the time I found out where she had ended up, it was too late." Elizabeth's stomach twisted. "Too late?" The judge flipped another page. "Ms. Sinclair, it appears that your original guardianship request was denied due to concerns raised by social services." Rebecca's jaw tightened. The judge kept reading. "There were multiple reports of emotional abuse filed against you in regard to your treatment of Ms. Carter when she was a minor. The court determined that it was not in the best interest of the child for you to take custody of Lily Parker at that time." Elizabeth's breath hitched. There it was. The proof. Even back then, the system had known. Rebecca was never fit to raise Lily. And now? She never would. The judge let out a heavy sigh. Given this new evidence, the court sees no grounds to grant Ms. Sinclair guardianship of Lily Parker. Rebecca's face darkened. Furthermore, the judge added, Ms. Sinclair's previous attempts to conceal her interest in this case raise concerns. The court will be issuing a restraining order, preventing Ms. Sinclair from making further contact with the child. Elizabeth's heart stopped. "Does that mean?" she started. The judge nodded. "Ms. Carter, the court grants you full and permanent custody of Lily Parker." A collective gasp ran through the room. Rebecca stood abruptly, seething. "This is ridiculous. That child belongs to me." The judge banged his gavel. "This ruling is final, Miss Sinclair. If you disrupt this court again, I will hold you in contempt." Rebecca's nostrils flared. Her hands shook with rage. Then, slowly, her icy gaze locked onto Elizabeth, and in a chilling, quiet voice, she said, "You'll regret this." Elizabeth didn't flinch. For the first time in her entire life, she met her mother's gaze without fear. "No," Elizabeth whispered. "You will." Rebecca's lips curled into a sneer. And then, she walked out. Just like that, the war was over. Elizabeth exhaled shakily, barely believing it. Lily was safe. She was hers. Forever. Later that night, back home, Elizabeth sat on the couch, Lily curled up beside her. Lily's small voice broke the silence. "I don't have to go anywhere?" Elizabeth pulled her close. "No, sweetheart. You're staying right here." Lily hesitated, then whispered, "You promise?" Elizabeth's throat tightened. She had made mistakes. She had doubted. She had almost lost everything. But not anymore. She kissed Lily's forehead, whispering the only thing that mattered. "I promise." And for the first time in her life, she meant it. The nightmare was over. For the first time since stepping into that courtroom, Elizabeth Carter felt free. Rebecca Sinclair was gone. Not just physically, but out of their lives for good. The restraining order ensured she would never legally come near Lily again. And without custody rights, she had nothing left to fight for. Elizabeth could finally breathe. And yet, as she sat in the quiet of her living room that night, Lily nestled against her side. She knew this was only the beginning. Because winning custody was one thing. Being a mother was something else entirely. The days that followed felt surreal. Lily didn't have to worry about being taken away anymore. But she was still adjusting to the idea that this home, Elizabeth's home, was hers too. Elizabeth noticed the small things. How Lily still packed her stuffed rabbit in a small bag every night, as if preparing to leave. How she hesitated before opening the fridge, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to. How she still flinched slightly when someone raised their voice, even if it wasn't in anger. Elizabeth's heart ached. Lily had spent years believing she didn't have a home. It was going to take time before she truly believed this was forever. But Elizabeth was willing to give her that time. One morning, as they sat at the kitchen table, Lily looked up between bites of cereal. "So, what happens now?" she asked. Elizabeth smiled. "Well, first, we need to find you a school." Lily made a face. Daniel chuckled from across the table. "It won't be so bad, kid." Lily tilted her head. "Are you going to be around too?" Daniel hesitated. He glanced at Elizabeth, as if waiting for permission to answer. Elizabeth exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about her. This was about Lily. And Lily liked Daniel. So Elizabeth nodded. Daniel smiled softly. "Yeah, kid. I'll be around." Lily's shoulders relaxed. And for the first time in days, Elizabeth saw it. A glimpse of peace. One evening, Elizabeth was helping Lily brush her hair when the little girl spoke softly. "Are you happy I found you?" Elizabeth froze for a moment, her fingers still tangled in Lily's soft curls. Then she knelt down, so they were eye level. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me." Lily's eyes shimmered. And then, so quietly, she said something that nearly broke Elizabeth's heart. "Okay, Mom." Elizabeth's breath hitched. "Mom." It was the first time Lily had ever said it. The word wrapped around Elizabeth's heart, squeezing until her throat burned. She swallowed hard. "What did you just say?" Lily hesitated. "Mom," she repeated softly, almost testing it. "Is that okay?" Elizabeth felt tears sting her eyes. She reached out, pulling Lily into her arms. "It's more than okay," she whispered. "It's perfect." Lily smiled. And at that moment, Elizabeth knew. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She wasn't just a woman trying to fix her mistakes. She was Lily's mother. And that was all she ever wanted to be. The past year had been a journey. There were ups and downs, challenges, fears, but also so much love. Lily thrived. She had friends now, a school she loved, a bedroom filled with books and drawings. And more than anything, she had a home. One evening, Elizabeth sat on the porch with Daniel, watching Lily ride her bike down the sidewalk. "You did good, Liz," Daniel murmured. Elizabeth smiled, watching Lily laugh. "We did good," she corrected. Daniel chuckled. "So, now that things have settled, what's next?" Elizabeth took a slow breath. For the first time in her life, she wasn't running from anything. She wasn't drowning in regret or fear. She was exactly where she was meant to be. And so, she smiled. And she answered honestly, "Whatever happens next, we'll figure it out together." Because for the first time, Elizabeth wasn't alone. And neither was Lily. They had each other. And that was all they ever needed.